Hello, Ayo Akinwolere here. Welcome to the Athletic FC podcast. Why is it that every time Arsenal get a set piece, it feels like they'll score? I'm joined by the Athletic's Phil Hay, one of our tactics writers, Liam Tharme, and former Premier League defender, Nedum Onuoha. Liam, let's start with you. It's really interesting sort of set pieces, and I guess it's quite hard to define what a set piece is, especially in modern football. But from your perspective, what do you class as a set piece?
I think people usually limit it historically to probably free kicks, direct or indirect and corners. There's an interesting move now towards sort of, as we're going to talk about sort of the coaching perspective, some people consider themselves like restart coaches or would do restart analysis. So that would obviously then include possibly even goal kicks, kickoffs. So any sort of dead ball situation where the ball, the game's gone dead or the ball's gone out of play. So I guess the beauty or the problem with it is, and it depends who you ask, it can include a wide range of things or sort of very, very few things. But I think generally from an attacking and defensive perspective, it's generally the stuff that's going to directly sort of end up in shots or chances is the main focus normally.
Yeah, Nedum, I guess we're really focusing on set pieces now as we're talking about Arsenal in the modern game. But I mean, let's face it, it's just something that's been around for a fair bit of time, right?
Yeah, absolutely it has. I think at times though, from when we were younger, assuming everyone here was born in and around the 80s, except maybe Liam.
Only just.
It was almost like a conversation which was left for the teams who couldn't outplay another side, so they just had to be good at set pieces. You're
Mm.
thinking about, say, Stokes, Boltons, and so on back then, and even before that, other teams in the 90s Premier League. But it's an important part of the game, and I think as the years have passed, I think we've reached the point where we can actually have that conversation, understand that's the thing. And Liam made a good point because when he was talking about set pieces, like restarts was one. And I
Mm.
remember I think it was around 2015, we spent a lot of time about how to have our goal kicks. And I think the only thing that hasn't really changed over time is that people are still watching it. Obviously, some people are unhappy with something, happy with something, but they don't understand the why. And the why is, I think, at times the most important thing because if you understand the why, you can see why teams persist with certain elements. It's the example where, say, somebody doing commentary on the game hates it when there's a short corner played, but a short corner is for something else. And it's like, oh,
Mm.
but the big guys have come up from the back. I'd be so
Mm.
angry. I'm like, maybe you wouldn't be angry if you knew why they were playing the short corner. So I think stuff like
Mm.
that matters and it can affect the way that we feel about, say, certain things happening on the field.
Yeah, this is why these kind of conversations are really interesting, just to open up the dynamics on a football
Mm.
pitch, especially around tactics as well. Phil, Nadim mentioned a name, a blast from the past, Stoke City, Tony Pulis as well. Coaches like him. Do you think at the time those kind of methods that maybe Pulis adopted and teams like that adopted were maybe frowned upon?
Oh, very much so. Great example, Stoke. I think you could probably say the same about Sam Allardyce as well, particularly at Bolton, where I think people look back at Allardyce now and realise that he was quite ahead of his time when it came to studying data and paying attention to it. But back in that era, set pieces or teams who were strong at set pieces, um, it was almost regarded as compensation for the fact that they weren't particularly good at playing open play football. You know, they weren't regarded as being attractive. They didn't have the kind of levels of skill or dynamism of better teams. And it was like their marginal gain, wasn't it, to close the gap? And actually, I saw something similar at Leeds with Marcelo Bielsa, but to the opposite degree. There was a particular period where they were terrible at defending corners, conceded a lot of goals from those situations. And it wasn't that Bielsa didn't take any interest in them. If you look closely at what they were doing, you could see a definite structure and a deliberate pattern. They just didn't seem to have it nailed and didn't seem to be able to make it work. But there was a kind of prevailing view among the fan base at Leeds that that was almost a badge of honour. What they did in open play was so good and at times so brilliant under Bielsa that they were quite happy to say, yeah, we're no good at set pieces, but we don't care because open play is where it's at. And I think that has become quite an old-fashioned view, and we're now in an era where set pieces do matter. And as Nedum was saying there, and Liam as well, not just corners and free kicks. It's the entire game now. It's any kind of situation which represents a restart or a dead ball. you can find gains in, and that has to be why we've kind of seen the birth of the specialist set piece coach.
Yeah, Liam, there's a piece that just dropped on The Athletic with you and Ahmed Walid titled "How Do You Stop Arsenal from Scoring Corners?" I don't think you should have dropped that for a lot of other teams. Come on, bro, you can't be throwing stuff like that out right now. But real talk, Arsenal are scoring 6 goals per 100 corners over the last 3 and a bit seasons. Can you just put that into context? Because 100 corners and 6 goals, I mean, that doesn't sound like a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, that's still quite effective in the way you're looking.
I think the average tends to be about 2 or 3%, and that's a big thing. Some of the early sort of data analytics books in football were big on sort of almost sort of bashing football fans for celebrating corners or set pieces, being like, actually, guys, you know that sort of a very low percentage of these end up in goals, but it's always the balancing act between the chance quality you tend to get from set pieces when they do come off. You get these chances close to goal that can be really, really valuable. And I think what a lot of the analysts took away from it at that time was not a thing of these are bad situations, we shouldn't train them. Is actually these can make and these account for a really decent amount of goals. You can go back to recent World Cups where they're sort of 1 in 3, 1 in 4 goals are coming from set pieces. It's people aren't training these enough. Like they're not doing enough sort of work on the training ground. They don't have enough sort of routines or variety or understanding or sort of buy-in. So yeah, Arsenal have been phenomenal. I thought it was interesting the way you can cut it with the statistics, that you sort of take the total goals scored. I think it's 44 from corners alone. Since Jover came in the summer of 2021. I thought for me the most interesting statistic was of the 24 Premier League teams they've played since he joined, they've scored from a corner against 19 of them. And I think Liverpool are the only team they've played in every season since Nicolas Jover arrived that they haven't scored against. So almost everyone can't seem to find a way to stop them. And, you know, it's one thing, as you make a joke about sort of, doing the piece to analyse it, which came out from the question of seeing them sort of basically work the same routine against Man City and Tottenham, was this is actually quite an easy thing to diagnose or to work out, because a lot of their corners are similar in terms of the in-swingers and short corners, but actually stopping it and knowing what they're going to do doesn't mean you can suddenly stop them. They're quite unstoppable at this point.
Yeah, and Nedum, you look at that figure, 6 goals per 100 corners. From your standpoint as a defensive player back in the day, does that sound quite good for the amount of corners that were taken?
Back in the day seems a bit harsh. I'll be honest. I don't feel I'm that old, but sure, let's do that.
We're roughly the same age, man. So it's cool. I get it.
I think we're thinking about the end outcome being, you know, a goal as such, but how dangerous are they within that 100? And I think as we see now, some of the quality of delivery from the likes of Saka and the opportunities that they get, you know, not least of all 2 weeks ago when they played Man City, like Gabriel had a really good chance before he ended up taking his chance. And I think we are right that, to be honest, it sounds like you never really want to say this, but some of the things that as a fan you get excited about are really quite routine, because a corner as a set piece is a chance for not only the attack to attack in a set way, but the defense to defend in a set way as well. And a lot of the time it led to nothing unless the ball was perfect or there was a mistake elsewhere. But Arsenal and other teams, in fairness, because we can talk about the likes of Villa, for example, and others. They're basically, what I like about the way that they do things and what the biggest concern is, and believe it or not, this is going to be linked to Brentford, okay? So stick with me. What they do is they set up in a way which you're very unfamiliar with, and you might have seen it on TV or something when you've watched them play, but when they're actually doing it, and then you also see the size of that Arsenal team, it's actually a lot more difficult to deal with than some people would believe. So, for example, in the game against Spurs, where Gabriel scored after having that isolation 1v1 with Romero, somebody said, well, why don't you just send 3 players forward and then force them to take some back? Arsenal will send 3 players back who wouldn't have affected the chance anyway. So you're looking at Trossard and others, and you're still in the box with Ben White, a Saliba, a Gabriel. You're looking at a Rice, Havertz, and to have 5 big players after you've already sent back some other players is actually quite dangerous. But again, to link it to Brentford, when I played against them in the Championship, this was a good few years before they were promoted to the Premier League. They were one of the shortest teams I'd ever played against, but they were one of the most dangerous teams from set pieces, and it was because, like, they'd have 10 players, for example, standing on the edge of the box before the corner's coming in, and you don't know who's going to come into the box. Then all of a sudden it's like, who's got this? And it's that feeling of like, oh my gosh, like what do we do? What do we do? And we see that with Arsenal now and others, because you can sense that something is going on, but you don't know what it is. And given the
Yeah.
fact that most people have defended hundreds, if not thousands, of set pieces in their lifetime, that ability to cause confusion, whilst also the team that are doing it know exactly what's happening. And
Mm.
we've got to talk about delivery as well. It is truly remarkable and it's hard to stop. And people that think they have a solution, they tend to be the ones who aren't going 1-to-1 with Gabriel on the 12-yard mark with no one else around you. You know, that is a tough task in itself.
Yeah, you've mentioned Gabriel a couple of times now, and it's a player who's scored 12 of Arsenal's 44 goals from corners in the last three and a bit seasons. Declan Rice, speaking to The Athletic for my game in My Words in April, says, you know, if you watched him, Gabriel, train, he scores about three of them a day. Rice also says he's so aggressive. Even when he plays against the kids, he doesn't care. And now it got us thinking, you know, is it about a mentality of a player to get that over the line as much as the smart routines? Is it about pure desire, Nedum?
If I could jump in at this point, I think pure desire definitely does help because some of the best headers of the ball that we've seen, they aren't necessarily all like 6'5" or Peter Crouch at 6'7". You know, you look at the likes of Tim Cahill and certain people like that. You've got a Sergio Ramos who is just about 6 foot tall that scored millions of goals, it feels like. And what I would say it's about doing your job. There'll be people who go into the box who will be very unlikely to get their head to the ball, but they still form a part of why somebody else is going to be free. Say until Arsenal started tweaking a little bit, like the runs of Ben White to go and disrupt the goalkeeper, but to disrupt the goalkeeper late. If he's bad at that job, the goalkeeper comes out and he addresses the ball. But instead, now Arsenal, they've got multiple people around it. And what's impressive is they arrive late. So goalkeeper and other players feel they've got everything under control until at the last second they don't. And to put it into perspective again, as a player, and this is probably universal to every team, you'd work on set pieces, you'd get given the set pieces on a sheet of paper or a PDF or something to look at before a game. You'd see it on the wall going into the game, but there are still people who don't value set pieces to where they won't do their job properly. Like even to, again, reference myself, when I was playing in America, we needed to we were playing against LA Galaxy. This was during the 2020 season, so it was behind closed doors, and we needed to make sure that we won this game to have a chance to continue in the playoffs. And this is my last season, so I'm going to sound quite salty here, and I'm happy to be that. This is my last season, and on the Friday we worked on defensive set pieces. On the Friday evening, we got sent them as an email. On the Saturday, we watched a video of how to do the set pieces. Go into the stadium, set pieces were up on the wall. Then there was a wide free kick and we were setting up in a line and there was a gap. There was a 5-yard gap. And I'm thinking, why is this 5-yard gap here? Somebody should be in this position. Why is somebody not here? Why everyone else was in position, like who shouldn't be here? Cross comes in and they score in the gap. Somebody runs, free header goes in. They win 1-0. And that's my career basically done. And in the dressing room after the game, the guy that's supposed to be there says, "Oh, sorry, that was my fault. We'll go again next year." Oh gosh.
Next year, bro.
No, we won't.
Too late.
I was like,
We ain't doing that.
no. And if you buy into set pieces and do them properly, you'll gain opportunity. But some people, they go through the motions, and I like the clubs and the managers to where they make sure the players have a culture where set pieces are just as important as the run though before the game, before their training session, as important as the possession session, as the tactical side of things, because it's a part of the game that can separate you from others. Because say, for example, for as good as Arsenal have been over the last 2 years, would they have been in contention with other things if they weren't great at set pieces? And when you think of the talent that they have, you wouldn't have thought that would be the formula. But clearly, you could argue it's one of the things that was missing from them in years gone by.
It's a totally key point, that I think, and particularly because of how tight the Premier League table is, it'd be ludicrous not to think that if you could get small gains from set pieces that you ought not to bother. Something Nedum said there made me chuckle actually. About the kind of importance of corners or the way that supporters can react to corners when they're conceded. I remember Thomas Christiansen at Leeds saying to us, this was back in 2017, like why do you guys and the crowds in England, but I think it was mainly in the UK really, get excited when corners are awarded, because in other parts of Europe, it's more of a kind of rugby league style play the ball. A sort of uncontested restart of the game. I'm sorry to say that when I was thinking about this in advance, I was coming up with a million questions that I want to ask Nedum and Liam as well. And I want to come back to Nedum at some point on the importance of individuals in set piece routines, i.e. Gabriel, Saka and so on. If you don't have them, does a routine work anyway? But something I wanted to ask Liam was, how do you go about proving that you are a set piece specialist as a coach? What do you have to do to a club? Because anybody can turn up with Y-Scout and say, I would do X, Y, and Z, and this is how we would structure, and the sort of confusion that Nedum was talking about causing. But how do you, if you've got no real track record, convince a club that it's actually going to work, which is kind of the key point?
I guess that those are the conversations that people were having sort of 10 plus years ago, when people first came in and said, they're probably armed with a lot of data. It was genuine at the time. That's probably me now, as the guy with Y Scout, the guy with all the stats. Yeah, the diagrams. So there's no, to my knowledge anyway, there's no sort of like formal qualification for this. There's not like a UEFA Pro or UEFA A license equivalent. A lot of these guys will be coaches anyway, that then sort of have this as a speciality, that would have had backgrounds doing that and then said, oh, this is an area where I can really sort of get into it and research it more. So if I'm honest, I think the set piece coaches probably wouldn't like look at themselves as specialists in that sense. It's just an area of the game that they're good at and that they sort of do really well. And it's probably then just where they can add value as members of staff. There's times where I think often at academy level, I've experienced it where sort of the goalkeeper coaches get basically lumped with the responsibility of a set piece coach, because clubs that in age group teams haven't got the finances to employ people specifically in that regard. So it's definitely quite a modern thing. Yeah, it's I think still sort of finding its way and finding a path for it, really, because I don't even think every Premier League team has a formal person doing it, or if they do, it's a shared responsibility. So it can look very different for different clubs.
Should they have?
Yeah.
Should everybody now have a set piece coach, do you think?
I mean, I really, really like the title. Gianni Vio's formerly Brentford, formerly Tottenham, set piece coach, was with Roberto Mancini with Italy when they won the Euros. A thesis, that he did on set piece, and I think he called them the 15 goal a season striker. And in terms of like value for money, and there's a really simple way to look at this. Like, if you were to employ a set piece coach for say 100,000 or 200,000 pounds for a whole season, and they got you one goal, one additional goal from set pieces, compared to you look at the money you spend in terms of in the transfer window on players or on contracts and the money that goes there. In terms of value for money, they're always going to be really, really good, because they're just not going to demand what the players do. And sure, you can't then see it on the pitch, and you need the players to work. It's not just bringing in a guy that's got or a person that's got the routines. But I think they're definitely an area that clubs are now getting into, because it's, in terms of value for money, one of the easiest decisions you can make.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how important it is to mix things up, Nedum, and please follow on, Liam, on this one. You spoke about Brentford earlier, Nedum, and before you know it, that player's just popped out of nowhere, and you're like, oh, I've lost him. So you're not a predictable team. Let's say Gabriel is getting the lion's share of those headers for Arsenal, but sooner or later, teams are going to figure out what that routine looks like. So Jover has to come out with something, for his bag of tricks, just to confuse people, surely.
Yeah, he likely will, but his bag of tricks is probably near endless, to be honest. But he's just not had to use them at this moment in time. And the point I made earlier about the size of Arsenal is also key. So you could have a world where, say, if the biggest and best header of a ball defensively in the Premier League is now playing against Arsenal this weekend, and he goes and matches up against Gabriel, Gabriel might just walk outside of the penalty box. And before you know it, there's more space for all those other players to get the opportunity to head the ball. So it's not a case with Arsenal that it has to be this. They have that variability. They have a ton of players who can score those goals, whether it's, as I say, it's Ben White, it's Saliba who scored some as well. You're seeing the dominance of Havertz in the air. You're seeing Rice, you're seeing Partey's and others. And Calafiore's like, Arsenal aren't getting smaller. I'll tell you that for free. They're not getting smaller. So, yes, they might need to tweak things at certain points, but I think that's the beauty of those types of coaches, because they tweak it as and when it's needed. They'll look at the opposition and see where a soft spot might be in terms of how they cover teams, because some teams might want to defend like man to man. Some people might want to be in a full zone. And I think ultimately they'll decide what the best thing is that they can do to affect that in a positive way for them. But everyone that goes up into the box, the teams that are the most dangerous are the ones where you see they're taking their time. The person going to take the corner is taking their time. The ones from the halfway line are casually walking up, because they know that, this is what we're going to do. It's not going to be any sort of like, let's rush and get it done. They set it up. They put themselves in the right positions. They time it well. They don't always score, but they always feel dangerous as long as the service is good.
What do you reckon, Liam?
Oh, it's absolutely that. You keep doing it until it stops working, right? There's a really important part with set pieces where it's so tailored to the opposition and their strengths or their weaknesses. I thought sort of the difference between City and Spurs' approach, and obviously conceding basically what's a very similar routine, or the same taker from the same side and the same player that scored, was the balance between Tottenham matching up sort of size-wise and height-wise, they went centre-backs against centre-backs for Saliba and Gabriel with Van der Ven and Romero, whereas City went initially for Jeremy Doku up against Gabriel and then switched to Kyle Walker. And there's always
yeah.
And then there's always a balance of saying, well, you have the positive of if you match someone physicality wise, then the run that he should get on the defender shouldn't be as good. You should be able to disrupt him a lot more. But the problem Spurs had was Romero completely lost track of him. And then when Romero's lost track of him, well, now one of your best players aerially is completely out of the game, stood chasing someone. And they had, I think it was Solanke and Bentancur as the two central zonal markers, who are pretty tall guys, but not going to be as accomplished aerially as your centre backs. And fittingly, actually, for the goal, Bentancur steps forward, trying to track the fight of the ball, trying to head it clear, misreads it completely. He's moved a few yards forward, and Gabriel comes into the spot where he was stood and scored from there. So it's always a case of, do you want to actually try and stop the duel or stop the shot happening in the first place, or are you going to say, actually, we'll put a smaller guy, try and disrupt him a bit, but really we're going to say, we're not going to prevent the duel, but we're going to win it. We're going to put our best guys in the air, along that 6-yard box and say, come on then, come at us and we'll try and outjump you. And obviously this is ignoring if the keeper can come into play, etc. And then the delivery is massively important. Without having good takers, doesn't matter how good your routine is, you've got to hit the spots consistently.
Just really quickly, Liam, before I ping a different question at Nedum, do you see Arsenal adapting their approach in an attacking sense depending on who they're playing? Obviously, you're talking about Spurs and City, tweaking their defensive tactics to try and counter it. But what about Arsenal? Do they do different things?
I think they're interesting that there's a lot of sort of similar runs, particularly from the guys that are starting at the back post. Generally, there's 3 or 4 people towards the back post. There's some what can be sort of near post decoy runs, but then also there's times where they'll sort of hit the near post. They've definitely gone back post quite a bit more this season, which again speaks to the way the in-swingers work as well, is that you get that variety where you can kind of go front or first, second post or in the middle as well. But also in order to be able to have that sort of variety, you need to have enough good players that can attack the ball, right? Not just sort of one or 2 players. So there's been times where teams have gone sort of fully zonal against them. I think West Ham last season, and there was a really interesting move where one runner went early, pinned one of the zonal markers, and then Saliba came from behind and kind of jumped on top of them because they'd taken, I think it was Edson Alvarez, completely out the game. Palace at the Emirates have gone almost fully man-to-man with a sort of one sort of zonal guy at the near post. And I think when teams go sort of man-to-man, then, as Nedum was saying, they get a lot more sporadic with the runners. If runners start going kind of everywhere, and then all of a sudden you've got one centre-back who's beaten someone in loads of space in the middle of the box. So I definitely think teams that tend to do better have a bit of a mix of being man-to-man and zonal, so they can try and disrupt the runners, but also have people in position to try and jump against them.
See, one of the things, Nedum, that interests me with this is how much it all hangs on specific individuals. I remember growing up at university with a lad who was a Manchester United fan. He used to talk about how he'd go and watch David Beckham practicing free kicks and how Beckham would hang a tyre from the crossbar and try and swing free kicks through it, and was obviously very, very good at it because he was absolutely elite with dead balls. And I look at Saka and his ability to land it on the money time and time again, and also Gabriel, the way he attacks corners, how good he is in the air. And part of me then questions, if you took them out of the team and replaced them with, very, very good Arsenal standard players, but not those two specifically, would this be working as well?
Good question. Potentially not, but I still think it would be working. I think we look at the other side, and at times previously we've seen Rice taking in swingers, and I think they'd scored from a couple of goals from that side as well. We had seen Saliba score, and we've seen other players score for Arsenal, like Havertz, in around that 6-yard box. So I think the quality of Saka's delivery is something that should definitely be praised, and the way that Gabriel can attack the ball is very specific to him. But it's not the only way that they can do it. I think there'll be times when teams will try and go man-to-man with Gabriel, with their best header of the ball, maybe double team him and so on. But they'll still have a way to do it, even if the cross is from the other side. So yeah, it is limiting to a certain extent, but it's not like, well, Saka's not playing, so they're not going to score from set pieces. I think there's definitely more to the Arsenal side than just those two individuals. But that, as it feels right now, is when it's peak Arsenal set piece time, when Saka's out there on the right hand side doing his little shuffle before he whips it in. And Gabriel's about to just jump over the top of somebody.
Yeah, I was thinking even Declan Rice took his set piece duties seriously last season. I think a couple from just outside the box, and he was taking corners from the other side as well. Now, Nedum, You've worked through quite a lot of managers.
Well,
Didn't want to dig it in anymore, but what? Let's throw
yeah,
in there Mancini, Sven, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, Hughes, Redknapp, Holloway, Warnock, Bruce. I mean, incredible coaches.
yeah.
Out of those coaches, are any in particular that popped to mind and how they looked at set pieces, free kicks, and that kind of stuff?
That is a good question. For the profile of player and stuff that we had at some of the clubs that I was at, it was quite simple. You know, there were elements in there where they might have something special, and there's always an emphasis on like the first set piece from the right or the first set piece from the left. You'd always try and do something a bit different. But I'd have to say, overall, no. There was more emphasis on the defensive side of things because some of those managers wanted to go man to man, some managers wanted to go zone, some people wanted to do a hybrid, and sort of making those adaptations are different as well. And to talk about set pieces, there was a point where with one of the managers, we were so bad at attacking set pieces that I wasn't allowed to go forward anymore, and I had to be on the halfway line to stop counterattacks. So yeah, that's the other side of
Were you
the
demoted?
coin.
Were you demoted from set
Yeah,
pieces? Then,
well, it depends. Like, life's about perspective, isn't it? Some say it's a demotion from attacking, but very much a promotion for defending. So yeah, that was tough, but it was needed because we were setting up, and every time the ball would just inevitably hit the first person, before you know it, it's a 90-meter sprint to try and like stop a shot going in. So yeah, we had to tweak that, but I don't think any of my managers that I can think of right now made it as like a huge point of emphasis in terms of attack. There was stuff where you'd split into groups of two and you'd be trying to block for each other and the like, but there's nothing too, as the Americans say, would be too exotic in terms of play when it comes down to just getting set pieces in.
Let's just say you were more of an enforcer than a header in the box. Yeah,
Yeah.
sounds better.
Listen, I would have loved to score more, but instead I'll stop. I'll stop.
Here we go.
Yeah.
Phil, what about Leeds? When you were covering Leeds for years, how did you see this sort of emphasis on set pieces change over time?
Leeds are and presently fairly hopeless at them, to be honest. If you start digging into the stats to the moment, how they've been under Daniel Farke, there's been a long stretch of corners with very few goals returned. I obviously saw Warnock, who Nedum played under. I remember one of the centre backs at Leeds saying to me that the first day of training under Warnock, he said to his defenders, my centre backs don't take two touches. And, this might not have been strictly true, but the centre back was saying they spent the rest of that day practicing clearing the ball into the trees. So the different approaches from different managers. And I don't remember Warnock being massive on set pieces. I don't remember it being creative under him. But I think similar to what Ned's just said, I don't really remember anybody being wildly creative with them. And actually, when Gianni Vio was there in 2017, 2018, Leeds said exactly what Liam was saying earlier on in this podcast, that they felt by recruiting him that could be worth, 6, 7, 8, 9 points over the course of a season, which could easily in the Championship be the difference between the playoffs or finishing the top two if you're particularly good. And actually, as I recall, they scored once. Once from a particular set piece move, they started to concede heavily from defensive set pieces, at which point the narrative became, well, actually, Gianni only really works on the attacking side of things. He doesn't do the defensive side. And really, it wasn't a success. And to be fair to Gianni Vio, he seems to have been a success almost everywhere else, which people might say is the Leeds curse, really. But no, it's something that didn't really cross my radar there. And as I say, with Bielsa, it was far more, the focus was so much more strictly on open play and what they were doing with the ball at their feet. But I just think it makes total sense at the moment that if you're trying to be the best you can be in every aspect of the game, you can't simply put set pieces to one side and say, well, they're not fashionable or people don't like them or it doesn't reflect well on us if we're strong at set pieces. You want to be good at everything.
For sure. I just wondered whether this emphasis on set pieces has anything to do with sort of the cross-pollination of sport in general. Some various coaches talking about American sports and their love for American sports, American football, for instance. I guess less set pieces, more set plays, Liam. Do we see anything like that in terms of how perhaps American sports deem that in the way they play in comparison to maybe the way we see it emerging in the Premier League?
I'm not convinced on this one. I'll be honest. Maybe I'm a bit skeptical. I think there's definitely stuff that England spoke about. I think it was Alan Russell, the set piece coach under Southgate, or at least for I think 2018 World Cup, spoke about. I think a bit of maybe like inspiration or insight they took from like NFL running routes. and how they can sort of use that to manipulate it in different ways to exploit the defense. But I think there's just a case that a lot of coaches will enjoy like watching a lot of other sports. Then you often get pictures of our Guardiola's at the basketball or Arteta's here watching this. So I think there's obviously the difference of you're talking about sports where it's a throw and a catch, and you're obviously now talking about sort of kicking it and someone heading it, or how that works there. So that part is slightly different. But I think it's really healthy for coaches to engage with those other sports and possibly try and learn things, or at least be engaged with sports in a wider context. But I think if you were to watch back what a lot of teams were doing in the 2000s or the 2010s and compare it to now and sort of set pieces, I think a lot of it will be quite similar. Sure, the rules have changed on probably grappling and contact a little bit, but I don't actually think these things are completely that new or that different. It's just maybe a case that teams are putting more time, energy, money, etc. into it.
Yeah, I mean, while you were in the MLS, Nedum, and anything like that filtered into the MLS, because obviously you're looking at the emergence of a sport where you have other dominant sports already pre-established there.
Not quite, not quite. The sports are it's just different, isn't it? You know what I mean? Like, not least of all, say in some of the other sports that we speak of, even domestically when we're talking about rugby and so on, you've kind of got one team on one side and another team on the other. Whereas I think with football, the sort of mesh that you can have and the way that you don't necessarily have the same spaces, the way things are refereed, the general like laws of the game and such are so different that you can't say we're just going to focus on one thing in particular. I think the idea about having a playbook as such does sound quite sexy when we think about our football, but it probably won't go beyond probably about 3 or 4 set pieces. And when you've used them, say 3 or 4 times, well, you can't use them anymore because everyone's got footage of you doing it anyway. So yeah, in MLS, it wasn't really that much of a crossover unless, we're trying to sell it to that wider audience, say, oh, look how similar it is. But then also with football, we don't exactly have a timeout every 2 minutes either. So that doesn't help.
Yeah, something you spoke about, especially with Brentford earlier, and I know a lot of this is we've been talking about Arsenal and sort of their attacking prowess when it comes to set pieces is defending them and how tricky that can be. If you know your team isn't that great at set pieces and perhaps it's not something you've taken a priority over, Nedum, can you then get a bit of like phobia when it comes to set pieces? Is there an element of doubt amongst team members, or who takes responsibility?
Are you talking about attacking or defending now?
Defending.
Yeah, you can. And the same way that I mentioned before about, say, Brentford being good at attacking set pieces whilst having no height whatsoever, they were also quite good at defending them. And they just did things in a different way because they had to. I think some teams know going into any particular game that maybe the matchups aren't exactly what they desire. Like traditionally within football, maybe it's changed now. In a dressing room before a game, you will have the starting lineup, you'll have the bench written down on sheet of paper, then you have all the set pieces written down. And if it's like at times where we used to be marking, you'd have your name and then the person who you're marking next to you. There'll probably be some teams where those matchups are like horrible to look at when you've got, say, your little left back marking their third or fourth biggest player or something like that. So you do know that you are going to be short-handed, but I think a lot of the way that football works, and to be fair, a lot of sport as well, is just disrupting, doing the best that you can. I think when you see a matchup that isn't great in your favor, the fact is, say, Kyle Walker and Romero were the two players that were marking Gabriel in the times when he scored his last 2 goals for Arsenal in the North London derby against Man City. If they would have done a better job of disrupting Gabriel's run, Gabriel likely doesn't score. Nobody at that point is asking them to win the header, but can you disrupt it? And I think anyone of any size can disrupt. Like, this is what Brentford did really well all those years ago. I'm in the box with someone that's like 5'8", and I'm thinking this is Christmas. And just as I'm about to run, I get like a little elbow to the ribs, and now I'm half a step behind in terms of where I need to get to because the ball's coming in. So I think you can be short-handed. I think at times teams can get a sense of anxiety about it, but it's football. Like, goals will always be scored, but you make it as hard for the other team as possible. And I think the worst teams for me are the ones who don't do that because they just believe they have no chance anyway, because they're the ones who really are missing a great opportunity.
I suppose one of the big dangers is, particularly if attacking set pieces are becoming more fashionable or more productive, that the tension on defending set pieces diminishes slightly. I mean, if I think back to 2016 at Leeds, they had a period under Gary Monk where they were conceding a lot from corners, and after about a month or so, and it was the Chileno era, so managers were very much in peril when results were poor. They kind of said to themselves, this can't go on, So his assistant, Pep Clotet, set up the system defensively where they used Chris Wood and Pontus Jansson as free men when the corner was coming in. And it made a massive, almost immediate difference to the concessions. And I don't know, Nedum, whether you've seen over the years a switch from, I guess, the priority being on how you defend set pieces to now far more focus on how you attack them and how you make the most of them. I guess the main focus used to be don't concede from these.
I think that is right. Let's call football for what it is just for a second. Yeah, someone goes out to take the corner. What do we think? One hand in the air means near post. Two hands back post. Like it's quite vanilla, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm.
So you had to be good from the defensive side of things, and you had like big centre halves, possibly like a big midfielder. They'd be the big three marking. They'd just go and line up and take their biggest three players, and it was quite basic. So there probably weren't that many goals being scored because there wasn't that much effort being put in to be creative. So defensively, it's like the task was a little bit easier. And maybe in time, things have changed and, attacking them is a lot sexier. Because, through our lifetimes, again, like when we think set pieces or something a bit different, I do think of like Stoke. I remember Bolton and Blackburn, and there were teams who were doing it in a way where the most dangerous person from a set piece isn't always the person that gets their head to it. There's, I think it was William Gallas when he was Chelsea, Spurs, forget where it was. He was somebody who would only go for the second ball. It's the same for like a Harry Kane. So the person who'd have marking them is somebody who can be aware enough to get the second ball, as opposed to the person who looks in theory the most dangerous because they get their head to the first. So there's a lot of nuance to it, and being defensively good from set pieces, I think it's still undervalued, to be honest. I think it really is undervalued. But then what I would say in terms of slight wrinkle, some of the best teams in terms of how they defend set pieces are the ones who score after they've defended a corner. And that then falls in line with the likes of Liverpool, where all of a sudden Alisson's got the ball and Salah's running through 1v1 down the other end. Because as soon as the ball comes in, they know that the Van Dijks, Konates, and all these guys in the world, they're going to be able to defend it. And then they can it's like a set piece which Liverpool have to defend is likely the most dangerous time for the opposition team because something is about to happen. And that doesn't happen by chance. It happens because this is something else that they practice to try and reap the rewards of it.
I always think that set pieces, defensive ones, must be the cause of some of the biggest fights between players. I mean, there's that really famous video, isn't there, of Neil Warnock in the Sheffield United dressing room with Chris Morgan and Jagielka, and that comes down to a free kick that Wolves have scored, and he's basically saying you should have known who you were marking. And Nedum, I'm just sort of thinking, in open play, things happen. You get done by kind of killer balls or lovely play, but with set pieces, it must be a case of look. Everybody knew what they were supposed to be doing here.
Yeah.
And as you were saying about the MLS, sometimes somebody just doesn't bother.
Yeah, sometimes some people don't bother. Sometimes people just aren't switched on. And I think to think about a Neil Warnock type side, and unless I'm really wrong about it and I've misjudged him, like he'll know who the centre backs were supposed to be blocking. When you go man to man, listen, it's a long post game chat when your guy scored. It's super long because everyone like on the team knows whose man it was. And that's one of the reasons why I think over time you kind of switch towards being more zonal because then it was harder for somebody to just be able to be completely free. Like going man to man, there was a point where I played in Jamie Carragher's last game and I was marking him. I was man to man with him. And every time I was near him, I was thinking, why are 3 or 4 Liverpool players looking at me? And the reason they're all looking at me is because we're trying to get him a goal. So every time the ball's about to come in, I'm having to fight through 2, 3 players because they're all trying to block me. And, if we would have been in a zone, then that's less of a concern. And the block probably feels more obvious because you'll see someone running towards you trying to push you out the way. But again, if he would have scored from a corner, I know that that's on me to find a way to deal with it. And I guess over time, that's why things have changed a little bit because those matchups, it can be great. You can have a great header of a ball, but the moment you are sort of picked out with one person in particular, there are lots of other people who are going to try and affect you in a way which will allow freedom for the person trying to score the goal.
Such a story that I can't just look at you
honestly,
sway to Liverpool players around
like,
you. That's insane.
Why is everyone looking at me? I've got the guy here. Oh, it's your turn now.
You're right though. You are right though because in that video, Warnock says to Chris Morgan, if you are marking Julian Lescott like I told you, and somebody else scores, I'm not shouting at you. I'm not blaming you. So you do what I've told you, and we're all happy.
Yeah.
Well, not all happy, but
Yeah, of course.
you're out of trouble. Yeah.
Yeah, Liam, let's bring this together because I mean I think we've probably succinctly come to the point that modern football, you need to be good at set pieces, both offensively and defensively. And I'm just thinking about the newly promoted teams who probably aren't equipped to play ball to ball with people like Manchester City. How important that potentially could be in those really marginal gains.
I'd say so. I think it's easy to underestimate actually the role they play. Sorry, in the title race. You look at Liverpool under Klopp, especially the season they did win the title. City under Guardiola have been two of the best set piece teams in the Premier League, and sure they'd probably take more corners and free kicks than anyone else by virtue of being so dominant and so good going forward. But there will probably come a point where I'm not saying it's necessarily going to decide where the title goes, but will play a really big role in actually determining sort of the placings, who gets Champions League football, who doesn't. And then there's then naturally the impact of teams that tend to be good going forward also tend to be good defensively because you've probably got bigger players. You've got players who, as they were saying, are more switched on. And presumably who can cooperate together if they're working together to block a player together. They're actually probably pretty good at knowing, okay, he's here in the zone, I'm here in the zone, and can cooperate. But I think it's a really, really big part, and I don't think a team now can win the Premier League without being not necessarily the best, but definitely probably top 2 or 3. Especially when you look at how many points now it takes to win the Premier League title. We've had 2 seasons of record-breaking goals. I think you can't win the league these days without being a top set piece side.
Gents, thanks so much for your time. Nedum, Liam and Phil as well. Adam Leventhal will be back with Nick Miller and Tim Spears for the preview tomorrow as they look ahead to Aston Villa welcoming Manchester United to Villa Park, fresh from that historic win over Bayern Munich. We'll catch you soon. If you want to watch more episodes of the show, please subscribe to the channel. We'll be joined by the likes of David Ornstein, Matt Slater, Adam Crafton, Carl Anker, and plenty more through the season. If you'd like to listen to the episodes in full in audio form, search The Athletic FC wherever you get your podcasts from.